Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into another fascinating piece of history.
Always. What do we got today?
Today, we're taking a closer look at An Educated Woman in Prostitution. It's a memoir written by Manada Devi in 1929 in Calcutta.
Ah, a first-hand account. Those are always so valuable. Gives you a perspective you just can't get anywhere else.
Exactly. And this one is particularly interesting because, well, she's an educated woman who ended up in prostitution. It's not a story you hear every day.
Definitely not. Makes you wonder, what were the circumstances that led her there? What was life like for women in that time and place?
And that's exactly what we're going to try to unravel today. So Manada Devi starts her memoir by describing her childhood. Pretty privileged upbringing, actually.
Oh, how so?
Well, her family was Brahmin, her father a successful lawyer. They had a couple of homes in Calcutta, even a place in the suburbs with a garden. She talks about swimming in their private tank, playing pranks on the servants, all that.
Sounds idyllic. Quite a contrast to where she ends up.
Right. It's like she's setting the stage, showing us this world that's about to be completely turned upside down.
And when does that shift begin?
Well, first, her mother dies when she's quite young, only in 6th grade. Then, about a year later, her father remarries.
Ah, stepmother. I bet that added another layer of complexity to her life.
Oh, absolutely. Especially since the new wife was barely older than Manada herself. The relationship was, well, let's just say it wasn't all sunshine and roses.
Understandably so. So with these changes, her father probably became more distant, right?
Yeah, exactly. And Manada, she kind of retreats into the world of books, starts devouring novels, poetry, especially anything about love and rebellion.
Interesting. You think that was her escape, her way of coping with all the changes and maybe the emotional neglect at home?
I think so, yeah. It's almost like she's seeking solace and maybe even inspiration in those stories.
Makes sense. Around this time, she also gets a new tutor, Mukuldada.
Right. He becomes a close confidant, someone she can really talk to. Later on, he even publishes a book of poems dedicated to her.
Wow. He must have had a big influence on her as well.
Oh, definitely. He exposes her to the world of literature and art, a world that seems so different from the one she's living in at home.
So we've got the loss of her mother, the strained relationship with her father and stepmother, and then this escape into books and the influence of her tutor. Quite a mix of factors shaping her early life.
And then there's Ramesh Datta. He's her father's nephew, and he comes to live with them. Described as charming, but there's this sense that maybe he's not entirely trustworthy.
And I'm guessing Manada, being vulnerable and longing for affection, gets drawn to him.
You got it. This is where her fascination with romantic literature might have played a role. All those stories of passionate love, defying societal norms, it probably fueled her feelings.
Ah, the power of stories to shape our perceptions and actions, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse.
And in this case, it leads to a pretty dramatic turning point. Manada runs away with Ramesh Datta.
Wow. At 15, that's a bold move. What made her take such a drastic step?
Well, she's yearning for love, freedom, excitement. She's also disillusioned with her life at home. It's like she's throwing caution to the wind and chasing after this idealized version of love.
I can imagine the allure of that, especially for someone who's been immersed in romantic literature. But real life is rarely as glamorous as fiction, is it?
Unfortunately not, and Manada learns that the hard way.
What happens? Does Ramesh Datta turn out to be not who she thought he was?
He does. He's deceptive, he's financially unstable, and ultimately he abandons her. In a Mathura, pregnant and alone.
Oh, that's terrible. What a betrayal. And to be in such a vulnerable position, what does she do?
She manages to make her way to Vrindavan, finds temporary shelter in a Mahant's hermitage, but even there, she faces immense suffering, giving birth to a stillborn child.
Oh, that's just heartbreaking. To go through all that, the betrayal, the abandonment, the loss.
It's a lot for anyone to bear, let alone a young woman in her situation. And it's at this point, feeling lost and desperate, that she ends up at the Calcutta Rescue Institution.
Ah, you would think that would be a turning point for the better, right? A place of refuge, a chance to start over.
You would hope so, wouldn't you?
Sadly, no. The institution, it doesn't really live up to its name.
Oh no. What happens there?
Instead of support and guidance, she finds, well, more exploitation. It's almost as if the system is designed to keep women trapped rather than help them escape.
So it's another dead end for her.
Yeah, pretty much. And after a while, she, along with the Rajbala and Kalidasi, they get kicked out.
Oh, wow. Back to square one.
Essentially, they find temporary shelter, but the pressure to enter prostitution, well, it just keeps mounting.
I can only imagine.
Their landlady, this shrewd woman, she argues that, well, why shouldn't women use their beauty, their wit, their assets to make a living? She even compares it to other professions, saying everyone else sells something, whether it's their intellect, their skills, or their labor.
Hmm. Yeah, I can see how in her situation, surrounded by hypocrisy and limited options, that argument might have resonated with her.
It does make you think, right, about societal expectations and the limited choices available to women, especially back then.
Absolutely. So she enters this world, and what's fascinating is how she begins to observe and analyze everything around her.
She describes the different types of clients she encounters, the power dynamics, the whole ecosystem of prostitution.
It's like she's providing a map of this hidden world, a world that exists alongside but separate from mainstream society.
A hidden geography, I like that.
She talks about Harkata Lane, where she first starts working, then Ramagan, and finally Sonagachi.
Sonagachi, the infamous red light district. Each location catering to a different class of clientele, reflecting the social hierarchy of Calcutta at the time.
Exactly. And within this hidden world, she encounters all sorts of men, professionals, intellectuals, even those involved in social reform movements.
The hypocrisy is astounding. Makes you realize that things weren't so black and white back then.
Oh, absolutely. Remember, this is 1929 India. Nationalist movements are gaining traction. There's this era of change and unrest.
And Manada is right in the middle of it all. She even talks about being involved in fundraising for flood relief and participating in the non-cooperation movement against British rule.
It's incredible. On one hand, she's fighting for a just and equitable society, and on the other, she's trapped in this profession often seen as a symbol of exploitation.
It's a paradox for sure, but it also shows that even within those movements, there were contradictions.
How so?
Well, she describes how some of the young men initially drawn to the movement by idealism end up becoming corrupted. She even notes how the close interactions between women working in prostitution and these men sometimes led to unintended consequences.
I see. A reminder that even movements with noble goals can have unforeseen and potentially harmful side effects.
Exactly. And her perspective is so valuable because she's both an insider and an outsider. She's part of the struggle for freedom, yet she's acutely aware of the hypocrisy and moral ambiguities within it.
So insightful. And then there's her discussion of literature and its impact on societal perceptions of women.
Ah, yes. She talks about how earlier writers often portrayed fallen women as objects of scorn and punishment. But then you have this new wave of writers like Rabindranath Tagore who offer a more nuanced view, even romanticizing these characters.
It's a shift that reflects the changing social landscape, right? These new portrayals challenge traditional moral judgments, but also perhaps contribute to a greater acceptance of relationships with women in prostitution.
It's interesting to consider, isn't it, how literature both reflects and shapes societal norms and how Manada's own reading might have influenced her choices.
Absolutely. And as her story unfolds, you start to see her become more aware of her own agency, even within the confines of her situation.
She realizes that she can use her education and social skills to her advantage.
So she develops a new strategy.
Exactly. Instead of just accepting the status quo, she figures out how to play the game by her own rules. She transitions from the crowded lanes of Harkata and Rambagan to the more upscale neighborhood of Sonagachi.
So she's going up market.
Precisely. But it's more than just a change in location. She starts leveraging her connections to powerful men, using them as facilitators for her business.
Wow, it's almost like she's becoming an entrepreneur in a way, identifying a market, building relationships, finding her niche.
You could say that, but of course, it's still a morally complex situation. She even creates this false persona, Miss Mukherjee, to entice wealthy clients.
Playing the role of a respectable, educated woman, deceiving them, manipulating them.
It's a high wire act. She's constantly navigating these different identities, blurring the lines between reality and deception.
And it takes its toll. There's this one scene that really stands out where she encounters Upan Babu, a friend of her cousin, Nandadada.
Ah, yes. It's a powerful moment. He tells her about her father's heartbreak and her cousin's attempts to find her.
It's like a window into the life she could have had, the family ties she severed.
And Nandadada, despite being involved in the freedom movement, has managed to maintain his moral compass. It's a stark contrast to the world Manada is now inhabiting.
It's a turning point for her internally. The encounter reawakens her guilt and longing for a different life.
It forces her to confront some difficult questions. Can she ever escape this world? Can she find redemption? Tough questions for sure. And as her memoir progresses, it becomes clear that she's not just reflecting on her personal journey, but also on the society that allows this exploitation to flourish.
Right. It's almost like she's holding up a mirror to society, exposing the hypocrisy and the systems that perpetuate this cycle of injustice.
Exactly. And she doesn't shy away from naming names either. She calls out individuals and institutions, from religious figures to prominent social reformers.
Every punch is pulled?
Not at all. There's this one striking example. She describes a wealthy zamindar, a landowner, who throws these lavish parties, even inviting Manada and other prostitutes to entertain his guests.
Wow. Talk about a contrast between outward respectability and what's happening behind closed doors.
Right. It makes you wonder who's truly fallen in this scenario. And it's not just the men who are complicit. She observes how some women, particularly those in positions of influence, actually help to uphold these harmful norms.
This is where her observations about the SARTA bill debates come in, right? I mean,
Yeah.
with those who don't know, the SARTA bill was an attempt to raise the age of marriage for girls, a practice that often led to young brides being forced into prostitution.
Precisely. And she sees the hypocrisy of those who advocate for women's rights while simultaneously condemning and ostracizing women who have been forced into prostitution. It exposes the limitations of a movement that fails to address the root causes of gender inequality.
It's a complex issue, for sure.
Yeah.
And Manada Devi doesn't pretend to have all the answers.
No, but her insights are so valuable because they come from someone who's lived through these experiences. She's not just theorizing about social change, she's grappling with its messy reality.
Absolutely. It's clear that this memoir is more than just a personal account. It's a powerful indictment of a society that fails to protect and empower women. And it's a testament to her resilience, her refusal to be silenced.
Her voice is raw, honest, and thought-provoking. She forces us to confront our own biases and assumptions about women in prostitution, to see them as individuals with complex lives and experiences.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what can we take away from Manada Devi's story? What does it tell us about ourselves and the world nearly a century later?
I think it reminds us that the fight for social justice is far from over, that true progress requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the systems we live in.
It's a story that challenges us to think critically about the choices we make, the forces that shape our lives, and the ways in which we can contribute to a more just and equitable world.
Manada Devi's story might be rooted in a specific time and place, but her reflections on morality, hypocrisy, and the struggle for agency resonate deeply in our own time.
Her story reminds us that even in the darkest of circumstances, the human spirit can find ways to resist, to adapt, to carve out a space for itself. And that's a message that I think is both powerful and enduring.